All right, so we know that there's these three different kinds of muscles that we have: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. But because we're most interested in exercise, and that's what this course is all about, we're really going to focus on our skeletal muscle because that's what's going to help us exercise. And so our skeletal muscle are these tissues that go from bone on one side to bone on another side. And the muscles, all of them are going to pass across a joint. Okay, so my bicep muscle, at least one joint. So my bicep muscle crosses actually two joints. It crosses my elbow joint and it crosses my shoulder joint. So it can do two things. It can lift my arm at my shoulder and it can bend my elbow at the elbow. Okay, so it can do two different jobs, and that's because it's attached to the bone on each end with a tendon. And that tendon is a connective tissue that's going to hold the muscle to the bone. And that's what its job is. And we're going to talk about how important that structure is for our movement as we go through the course. But on both ends of the muscle, you have a tendon that is attaching it to its bone. And then within the tendon, then that connective tissue is going to open up. And now you're going to get these specialized muscle cells that I showed you in the last video that are these striated muscles, these striated muscle cells that are tubes that are fused, single cells that are fused together. And each of those long tubes is going to be down here at this bottom part where we're looking at a single muscle fiber. So if you're looking at this is taking a big muscle, you looking a little bit closer on a group. So if we've got our muscle here, and then inside our muscle, and you'll have seen this if you've ever eaten a steak, where you'll see that there's like this white stuff that's in there, and that's separating some of the muscle from other parts of the muscle. And what that is, the white stuff is this connective tissue. And the connective tissue that you're seeing separating some of the muscle fibers is called the perimysium. Peri means around, myo meaning muscle. And so what this is on the outside of groups of muscle fibers. And we call a group of muscle fibers a fascicle. It's right here, fascicle. So basically what we have is we have a big muscle made up of lots of different fascicles, and each fascicle is made up of lots of different muscle cells or muscle fibers. So a fascicle is a group of muscle fibers, and a muscle is a group of muscle fascicles. Okay? And around each muscle fiber, we have another little connective tissue layer called the endomysium. And the endomysium goes around each individual muscle fiber. The perimysium goes around each fascicle, and the epimysium goes around each muscle. Okay? And then on the top of the epimysium, we have extra connective tissue called the fascia. And the fascia is important because what it allows to happen is it allows two different muscles to slide past each other. And so when you get a muscle knot and you feel like, oh, there's a real tight spot there, a lot of times that's two different areas of fascia that are connected to each other. So two different muscles that are supposed to slide past each other, but instead of sliding, they get a little bit of an adhesion and they don't move so well. All right, so we've got our muscle made up of fascicles, our fascicle made up of fibers, and then our fibers are made up of our contractile proteins. Okay, and so these are the things that are going to allow us to actually cause our muscles to contract. Okay, so when we look at our muscle fibers, they're made up of these proteins, and the proteins are organized into this really interesting structure that gives it stripes. And the stripes are what we see as each stripe, the area between two stripes that are side by side, is the smallest unit of a muscle, and it's called the sarcomere. Okay, so the sarcomere goes from what we call the Z band, or the Z line on one side, to the Z line on the other. And it's this Z line, this very structured line within the cell, that we see as the striation. Okay, so you have this Z line on one side, a Z line on the other side, and then in between those two lines is all the working stuff, is all the machinery that's going to allow us to contract our muscle. Okay, so between two Z lines, that's your sarcomere. Smallest unit of muscle that we have. So this is the smallest functional unit, which means that this is the part that we're going to actually shorten. And so when a muscle contracts, what it does is it takes those two Z lines and it pulls them closer together. All right? So when people describe this, they talk about the sarcomere, and the sarcomere is made up of these different zones and bands. Okay? So the Z line on one side, the Z line on the other side, is where you've got the lines on both sides of the sarcomere. The H zone, or the A band, or the I band, are different regions where we've got different amounts of the different proteins that are going to make up our muscle. So our sarcomere has two really big general classes of regions in it. One thing in the sarcomere is the thick filament. That's in the center here. And you can see it's got little mittens. And the little mittens, like you would expect, the mitten is where we're going to grab things. Okay, and this is going to be our grabbing and our motor. So this is where the thick filament is where we're going to have the motor that is going to allow us to pull the sarcomere shorten. And when we pull the sarcomere shorter, that's what's going to allow us to contract our muscle. So the thick filament contains the motor, and the thick filament is within this A band region. Okay, so the A band is the length of the thick filament. All right, so the thick filament has the motor in it. So the thin filament is the other key component of the sarcomere. And the thin filament, from our analogy before, the thin filament is the monkey bars. Okay, because that's what the thick filament is going to grab onto and pull. All right, so the thin filament is the monkey bar that attaches to the Z line, and the thin filament itself is going to be a key component of this shortening of the sarcomere to allow us to then pull the Z lines together and shorten the muscle. So in the area that only has thin filament, because there's no thick filament, because the thick filament hasn't moved into it, we say that's the I band. And then there's this H zone where the thin filament, that's how far apart the thin filament is, or the area of the sarcomere that is free from the thin filament. Okay? So when we cause a muscle contraction to occur, the A band stays constant. You're not shortening the A band because the A band, or the thick filament, is the thing that's grabbing and pulling. And it's pulling these two ends together. So what's going to happen is the H zone is going to get smaller. Does everybody see that? As I pull on this end of the sarcomere, on the right end, and the left end, those Z lines get closer together. When the Z lines move in, the thin filaments move closer together, and the H zone gets smaller. The other thing that happens is the I band, because the thick filament is now slowly making its way down the sarcomere, the I band also gets smaller. Okay, so when we do a muscle contraction, the A band stays constant, the thick filament pulls on the thin filament, and this shortens the I band and the H zone, and the result is that our sarcomere is shorter. And when we do that for all the sarcomeres that are lined up along this big, huge, long cell that we call a muscle fiber, now what happens is we've shortened the muscle fiber. And when we shorten the muscle fiber, that's going to shorten the fascicle. That's going to shorten the muscle. That's going to cause movement.